Hi guys, welcome to part 3 of the Tracker Knife Game Master tutorial series. Today we're going to be taking you through the low poly modeling and the unwrapping. Also, I want to apologize for the slight delay in getting these videos to you. I've been upgrading a couple of things, got myself a new blue mic, which hopefully the sound quality will be a lot better now for all the upcoming videos. So let's get started. I've sped this up 5 times, so hopefully you can still follow along if you're following along, or you can just watch and listen to me and I'll describe what I'm doing all the way through. So I'm using the Optimize tool, which you can check out in one of my 3ds Max quick tip videos. The Optimize tool is great because I can select full edge loops, cleanly remove all of the verts while removing the edge loops, and I can add edge loops in and adjust them as I see fit when optimizing my model. So the whole time I'm doing this, my main concern is to keep the silhouette of the object. I want to maintain all of the curvature. I want flat shapes to be flat, and I want curved shapes to be curved, and I want to try and get as much resolution into my object while minimizing the poly count. I imagine this knife to be for a next-gen game, and by next-gen I mean one of the newer consoles, PS4 or new Xbox, or just a really high-end PC. So I'm not going to reduce the poly count too far. I am going to reduce the poly count because there's no reason to just wildly have loads and loads of polys in there for no reason when we can reduce it, optimize it, and get better performance in the game. Even if it's just 0.1 of a frame a second, you do that on multiple objects and suddenly you've got 2 or 3 frames a second. So it's always good to optimize. It also makes the unwrapping easier. It makes the baking easier as well if we have a nice clean low poly. Now I'm not worried about triangles either here, so if I can reduce the polygon count and in doing so create some triangles, that's completely fine, because this isn't going to be a deforming knife. It's not going to bend in the middle, so the triangles aren't going to cause any problems whatsoever. Now I'm just optimizing further. I noted that I went a little far with the optimization here, and I want to make the low poly match the high poly a little bit more in this little section that's sort of cut in. So I've added an extra edge in there to maintain that curvature, and I've just reworked the topology slightly for this this lower blade part. Now I'm going to start cutting into the mesh around where the handle is. So I've gone into the left view here just to help, and I'm cutting around using the same amount of polys on the top and bottom just to match up with the polygon count of the handle, because we're going to connect these up all as one object soon. Deleting those parts on the inside and duplicating the high poly handle, which we're now going to optimize the same way as we just did the blade. You see now I'm deleting the inside and deleting the excess faces that are on the inside of these screw holes. A quick way of doing that was to use the border selection and then right click convert to face selection, grow it a couple of times, and then I've just hit delete. Now we're doing the same thing again as on the blade, using the optimize key, which I've got keyed to T on my keyboard, and I'm just collapsing edges, working out how I want my low poly topology to be here. I don't want to be reducing to triangles too much on the corners of this the chamfered edge of the handle, because it is a smooth surface, so I don't want it to be too triangular. But the flat surface, which is the side of the handle, it's a lot finer to have triangles there, because it's not going to cause quite as many or any smoothing errors once we've done our bake. So adjusting the topology more on the back section, reducing the polygon count, adding a few loops here and there to maintain the curvature. Now deleting all of the control edges that we used for smoothing around the serrated sections, because our hard edges now are going to come from the bake of the high poly. Just adding and removing more edges. believe it's good to do a weapon or a knife like this because it teaches you the whole process without going through something overly complicated. So as a beginner or someone wanting to get into video games or video game mod making some weapons for Battlefield, for example, or Counter-Strike, start with something pretty simple and master that, and then move on to something a little bit more complicated. So something like this knife is a good object to start with because it'll teach you all the concepts, and then you can go on to use those concepts in something a bit more advanced. So now I've got the handle and the blade connected, and I've just welded all the points in between and applied one smoothing group to the whole thing. That's only a temporary thing because later we'll apply smoothing groups to individual sections to control how our normal map is calculated. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail later, but now we'll unwrap the object. So with the low poly pretty much complete, I'm just going to select half of our model, delete it, and add a symmetry modifier on top because this knife is symmetrical after all. Now this model in particular wasn't very hard to unwrap. All I had to do was select all the polys and do a quick planar map from the side angle, and then use the relax by face angles, which you can find in the tools relax options. That pretty much took care of it. So now I'm just unwrapping the little ring at the back, selecting those polys, doing a projection on it. It's actually scaled to the full UV space, so I need to turn off normalized map. If you're using quick planar, you wouldn't need to worry about the normalized map toggle, but when using cylindrical or the planar projection methods, then you need to make sure that that map is off if you want your map to be scaled correctly in relation to the size of the polys. So I'm going to apply a red material to the object now. I like to name a new material low poly and add a red diffuse color, reduce the opacity to about 40%, and then have a look at my model from a few different angles and see how the low poly is matching the high poly. So immediately here I notice that the low poly isn't quite matching, so I'm selecting all the polys on the side and I'm just going to scale them outwards slightly, move them out, and so they match up a little bit more accurately. I'm also scaling the inside of the ring hole inwards a little bit to make sure that matches. And then I'm going to select the polys on the inside of the screw holes and move those out as well. The reason for doing that is simply so the low poly matches the high poly as accurately as possible. And we've got screws on top as well, so the low poly is trying to represent the high poly handle and the high poly screws all at once. So we need to make sure that the low poly is almost shrink wrapped to both of those surfaces at once, rather than maintaining the curvature of the inside of the screw hole. I noticed that the inner section of the high poly, which is the blade that goes through the handle, it didn't have any hole for the ring at the back, so I'm just adding the geometry there to allow for that hole, so when we bake it doesn't get in the way and cap the middle off. Deleting that poly and making sure that's at 0, and then that just runs right through now, so we won't get any issues there. So let's finish off the unwrap so we can move on to exporting the low poly and getting this baked off. So I'm changing the display preferences in the UV editor preferences window to 2048 by 1024 because I don't need a perfectly square texture for this. I want one that's slightly larger in width, because if I choose a square texture and only use half of it, well, that's going to be wasted space. And I don't want to stretch the texture to fill the square either. So I'm going to duplicate my knife by using the symmetry modifier, selecting the 1/2 of the symmetry on top with an unwrap modifier, and I'm going to flip that vertically. Now a little bit of jiggling around, and I'm going to render out a Uvw template. So if you go to Tools, Render Uvw Template, and I'm going to change my width and height to be the same as what we changed in the display preferences, and then hit Render UV Template. Now what we get here is basically our wireframe, which we can then open in Photoshop and use in our texturing process. So let's have a look at the final low poly. You can see that it's quite well optimized in all locations. I've kept quite a bit of geometry here for the serrated sections because they're going to be quite close up on screen, especially if the main character is holding it in first person view, because those serrated edges will be very close to the player's view, quite high res on the screen. So I've also added a little bevel here as well, just to catch the light and to help with the smoothing when we bake it. So let's have a look at the Unwrap. Now, one thing that we want to do before we texture is to check whether the Unwrap is the correct angles or not. So firstly, I want to have a look at the bottom. So I'm going to render out a UV template, which we had before. And then open that up in Photoshop. I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to write UV check, and I'm going to put it on the one side of my knife and then on the other side of my knife. I'm going to add a black texture in between and then save that out. Now we'll apply that as a material, as a diffuse bitmap to our object. UV check, click the show standard map and viewport button, and we can see that it's definitely fitting on this side, but on the other side it is flipped. So how do we address that? Well, we'll select the top knife with select element, select the top half of the knife. I'll do a horizontal flip, and then I'll also do a vertical flip, like so. So now that's matching up. We can read UV check there, and we can also read UV check on the other side. So that's exactly how we want it. So that was part 3. It was a little quicker, but it really was a quick process to unwrap it and to build that low poly from the high poly, just using the optimization techniques. So in the next part I'll go over baking, exporting to Xnormal. We'll do our bake and address any issues that comes up with, and we'll see how it all looks together in Marmoset. So see you in part 4.